Hey everybody. Um, this is the first part of Simon Leys, The Chairman's New Clothes, Mao and the Cultural Revolution. Um, this chapter is like 40 some pages long. I was looking to see if there was like sections in it which I could turn into like smaller videos, but I didn't see any. So this will be a longer video. The thing I was going to say is also that I can't copy and paste in this document. It's like a photocopied document, right? So I'm not going to be like looking things up. It's going to take too long for me to do that. So I'm going to be missing things. You're going to be missing things. Maybe you won't be missing things. But I am not able to look things up, which is probably for the best. I just like to look things up personally. So here we go. First part is called the quote Cultural Revolution end quote in its historical perspective. Quote, I must state that this history is by no means impartial. It does not maintain a wise and prudent balance between good and bad. On the contrary, it is frankly and vigorously on the side of right and truth. If a single line can be found where the author has diluted his account or his judgment out of respect for some opinion, some authority or other, let it cancel out the whole work. Quote, what, end quote, will you say? Quote, is there only one sincere person? Are you claiming a monopoly of faithfulness? End quote. That is not my intention. I would simply say that the more reputable people may maintain their respect for certain things and certain men, but that as judge of the world, history's first duty is to lose its respect. End quote. Michelet, Histoire de France. The quote Cultural Revolution end quote had nothing revolutionary about it except the name, and nothing cultural about it except the initial tactical pretext. It was a power struggle waged at the top between a handful of men and behind the smokescreen of a fictitious mass movement. As things turned out, the disorder unleashed by this power struggle created a genuinely revolutionary mass current which developed spontaneously at the grassroots in the form of army mutinies and worker strikes on a vast scale. These had not been prescribed in the program, and they were crushed piteously. Certain Western commentators insist on taking the official title literally, basing their interpretation on the concept of a, quote, revolution, end quote, in Chinese culture, or even in Chinese civilization. The term wenhua permits this double interpretation. In the context of such an inspiring theme, any attempt to reduce this remarkable event to the mean and trivial dimension of a, quote, power struggle, end quote, rings painfully, if not slanderously, in a Western Maoist ears. China's Maoists are less squeamish. The definition of the, quote, cultural revolution, end quote, as a, quote, power struggle, end quote, Chuan Li Tu Cheng. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Like I'll tell you this right now, I'm going to fuck some shit up in this piece. So, bear with me. Was in fact not dreamed up by the regime's enemies. It was the official definition used by Peking and constantly repeated in the editorials of the People's Daily, the Liberation Army Daily, and the Red Flag from the beginning of 1967, when the movement was sufficiently advanced to be able to do away with the protection of the cultural smokescreen behind it, which it had first set out. The idea that Mao might in fact have lost power must have been difficult for European observers to admit from their distant observation post. Nevertheless, it was with the aim of regaining it that he launched this struggle. What is astounding is that it should be necessary after 4 years of, quote, cultural revolution, end quote, to recall this kind of evidence to mind. In fact, in Europe and America, there are still contemporary China experts who will minimize, cast doubt upon, or deny the fact that Mao had been deprived of power. Why then should Mao have needed to scuttle the party and the regime, to bring the whole country to confusion in order to take power, if he had always held it? Worse still are those who deliberately ignore the vast amount of proof gathered through the, quote, cultural revolution, end quote, both in official documents, Peking press editorials, and in unofficial documents, wall newspapers, Red Guard publications. The main accusation directed at the power holders at all levels up to and including those at the highest level, the general secretary of the party and the chairman of the republic, was precisely that they had monopolized all power and exercised it in a fashion that Mao was able neither to control nor to influence. Why and how had Mao found himself in this situation? Before answering this question, it is necessary to take a look back at the, quote, Great Leap Forward, end quote, of 1958, and even, to a certain extent, the, quote, 100 Flowers, end quote, movement of 1957, and to highlight certain characteristic aspects of Mao's political style. In 1958, Mao launched the, quote, Great Leap Forward movement, which, like the, quote, 100 Flowers, end quote, episode of the year earlier, was not the result of a collective decision by the higher party ranks, but simply and essentially a product of Mao's own visionary inspiration. The principle of the, quote, Great Leap Forward, end quote, was to lessen China's industrial and economic underdevelopment by making use of the human resources of the whole country, galvanized by one unanimous burst of revolutionary enthusiasm, which would take the place of the basic equipment which was still seriously lacking or being too slowly installed. In short, in order to catapult China into communism, Mao's dream was to replace the material factor by the spiritual instead of electrical power, Lenin's words, revolutionary power. Here we have one of Mao's most striking idiosyncrasies, one which has found expression in numberless examples in Mao's writings and episodes in his career, an idealistic and willful approach to problems, which is in fact that of an artist or poet, for whom reality is not a ready-made element in any situation, but must be invented and fashioned to follow the demands of a purely subjective and inward vision. In this connection, a very significant example is the importance in Mao's work of the well-known anecdote taken from Leys of the old man who decided to move mountains with his own two hands. Official exegesis is quite right to set it out as a central theme of Mao's thought. Let us have no illusions about the quality of Mao's artistic creation. The fame of his poetry owes everything to his fame as a politician. If Mao had not played his particular part in history, his poetical works, which are slight and often clumsy, would not have stood out from the work of thousands of other amateur poets who flourished in each generation of Chinese scholars. Certainly the poet's inspiration meets the politician's experience to outstanding effect in the poem, quote, Snow, end quote, to the tune of Qin Yuan Chun, which is memorable in the same sense as Song of the Great Wind by Liu Pang, the founder of the Han Dynasty, or the poems of the military leader and statesman Cao So. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I feel like I might be wrong here, but it's like this is the guy whose General Tso's chicken is named after. Even if, as gossip has it, Mao's poem was corrected and reshaped by Liu Yatsu. But this single example apart, it is not difficult to agree with Arthur Wally's criticism, which used a pictorial comparison and rated Mao's poetry, quote, not as bad as Hitler's painting, but not as good as Churchill's, end quote. Mao's calligraphy is a fascinating reflection of Mao's personality. It is aggressively unorthodox and mirrors the flamboyance of an ego which will only accept rules of its own invention. In calligraphy, this sort of attitude can create something which is of high value when the calligrapher is in a position to base the liberties he takes upon a confident grasp of the discipline of his craft. Mao entirely lacks formal training, and this gives Mao's calligraphy its unpleasantly bold and bloated air. The bloated impression is exaggerated by enlargement of the small-sized originals when they are reproduced. But we are not concerned here with the quality of Mao's artistic output. What is particularly noteworthy is the degree to which his conduct and actions are conditioned by his attitude and drive as an artist. The same characteristic applies to several famous statesmen, men whose political designs were the reverse side of a kind of ill-expressed or stifled artistic creativity, or a substitute for it. Unable to master the language of literature or the plastic arts, these men have used peoples and empires as their material, as an outward expression of their inward vision. Footnote. This characteristic does not appear with uniform intensity. Julius Caesar's prose, Frederick the Great's music, Napoleon's unfinished novel, Churchill's historical prose and his painting, de Gaulle's essays and memoirs, So's poem, Mao's poetry, all of these generously reveal the particular nature of the political genius of their differing individuals, but in their case the artistic urge, while helping to explain their most brilliant political successes and their most outstanding failures, remained largely subordinate to the rationale of their political aims. In Hitler, who it seems fair to say might never have been tempted into politics had he been able to distinguish himself as a painter and architect, the phenomenon reached paroxysmal proportions. His military campaigns were subjected alternately to lightning flashes of strategic intuition and bouts of frenzy totally out of touch with objective reality. In the cases, on the other hand, of Nero, of Ludwig II of Bavaria, of the last southern Tang sovereign, Li Yu, and the Emperor Sung Hui Sung, the artist took over the man, ineffectually in the worst two cases, triumphantly in the others. Finally, it would be worth examining the case of artists by vocation and training who are later attracted to the illusory world of politics. Chateaubriand, de Annunzio, Marat, Ku Mojo, etc. There is room for a psychological study of the influence of aesthetics on politics. End footnote. A second characteristic of the, quote, Great Leap Forward was its rejection of the external world, of modernity, and its urge to return to the familiar bosom of the age-old, unchanged, self-sufficient Chinese countryside, that native soil of which Mao was himself the pure product. It is well known that Mao was little if ever exposed to the influence of the modern world, and Mao was barely acquainted with the intellectual and urban side of China, which had begun to open up to contemporary ideas. Works of Marxist doctrine carried little weight in the molding of Mao's thought compared with the Chinese classics, which from childhood had never ceased to kindle his mind. Several biographers have pointed out the influence upon Mao of the classical epic novels such as Shui Hu, quote, The Water Margin, end quote, or, quote, All Men Are Brothers, end quote, and San Kuo, quote, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, end quote. But the importance and significance of yet another of his favorite books, Shu Chi Tung Qian, The Universal Mirror of History as a Reference Book for Rulers, end quote, written by Sima Kuang in the 11th century, has not been sufficiently emphasized. This old-fashioned political handbook for the use of the imperial mandarinate was Mao's constant reading. He even saw nothing unsuitable in having himself shown in a recent official photograph at his desk with this cornerstone of the old bureaucratic order at his elbow in preference to any other work. An eloquent symbol. Within this bygone, enclosed world, Mao feels most completely at home. It was the scene of the most brilliant part of his career. Within it, Mao needs fear no rival, as the subjective intuition of his genius unhesitatingly matches objective reality. But these psychological roots in the country life of the past, the basis of Mao's strength up to 1949, were to become Mao's heaviest handicap after that date. This was brought out clearly in the crisis of the, quote, 100 Flowers, end quote, which calls at this point for some digression. The conquest of power in 1949. With the conquest of power in 1949, Mao found himself in an entirely new situation, confronted with problems of a kind which his earlier experiences could give him no help whatsoever in solving. What is more, these experiences were soon to hold back the advance of the machine he had set up. Guerrillas fighting barefoot in a countryside with which they were familiar, using patched-up equipment, improvising their strategy in the epic vein of So-So and Chut-Ke Liang. These were no longer needed. What was needed was the building and organization of a great modern state capable of facing present-day realities and the external threat. Henceforth, Mao's political judgment would have to tackle endless specialized problems beyond the scope of Mao's experience. Mao's grasp of them was uncertain, and Mao was forced to count on the special qualifications of a category of persons toward whom he had long fostered ambivalent feelings: the academic authorities, Chuan Wei, and the experts, Chuan Chia. The roots of these feelings lay deep in the past. As a young man, Mao Zedong, driven by a devouring intellectual curiosity, had admired and envied those of his comrades who had the opportunity to study abroad. In Shanghai in 1919, as Mao was seeing off a group of friends to the ship taking them to France, Mao confided in one of them, who had since told me what he said, all the discouragement and justifiable bitterness he felt, knowing that he was denied a similar opportunity to develop his talents. These feelings were exacerbated by his humiliating experiences as a lowly messenger in the library of Peking University. We need simply refer here to the well-known passage in his confession to Edgar Snow 20 years later, which brought to light the unhealed wound in his self-esteem. Quote, My office was so low that people avoided me. One of my tasks was to register the names of people who came to read newspapers, but to most of them I didn't exist as a human being. Among those who came to read, I recognized the names of famous leaders of the Renaissance movement, men like Fu Sunyan, Liu Chaolun, and others, in whom I was intensely interested. I tried to begin conversation with them on political and cultural subjects, but they were very busy men. They had no time to listen to an assistant librarian speaking Southern dialect, end quote. Mao. Mao's frustration drove him to make a myth out of these inaccessible beings and to ascribe to the academic world a power which it in no way even claimed. At the same time, the resounding successes which Mao achieved without the benefit of academic training led Mao to turn to deny that such people had any value. On taking power, the regime had adopted a welcoming and liberal attitude towards the intellectuals, inviting the intellectuals to offer their skills in the service of the people. The great majority of intellectuals enthusiastically seized the chance thus given them to serve their country. Even the large number of Chinese scientists and academics who had settled abroad were moved by patriotic fervor and returned of their own free will. However, Mao accepted only with the greatest reluctance the need to call upon the services of a modern intellectual elite, for which Mao felt an instant and almost uncontrollable mistrust and dislike, and which was in a position to call his judgment in question in each particular discipline. To begin with, however, Mao was lulled into believing that his elite had rallied to him in his personal capacity. The, quote, 100 Flowers, end quote, campaign, late 1956 to early 1957, brought a rude awakening. It would be misleading to think that the 100 Flowers movement was some sort of Machiavellian trick played by the regime in order to get its opponents to throw off the mask and expose themselves to repression. The wave of repression in which the movement ended was not the last act of a scenario prepared in advance, but rather an emergency measure hastily improvised to cut short an unforeseen and catastrophic development. The, quote, 100 Flowers, end quote, movement had been launched on Mao's personal initiative and against the advice of his collaborators who, better aware of what to expect from the state of mind of the cadres and intellectuals, foresaw a dangerous fiasco. Experience proved them right. The country's elite certainly made use of the freedom of expression suddenly granted it, but not in the manner foreseen by Mao. Mao envisaged it as producing positive criticism, which would purify and strengthen the regime and bring the regime a wave of voluntary and spontaneous adherence. But in fact, it became an increasingly rebellious and destructive criticism, which called into question the authority of the party and even that of the party's supreme leader. The, quote, 100 Flowers, end quote, left permanent scars. For Mao, the experiment finally confirmed the prejudices Mao had built up toward the intellectuals and led him from then on to consider the modern mind as the natural and unmanageable enemy of his power. For historians studying the rise, decay, and final collapse of Maoism, the 100 Flowers campaign will remain a crucial date, the turning point in evolution and first seeds of a disintegration. This first apparently feeble tremor was to be followed by the violent earthquake of the, quote, Great Leap Forward, end quote, and finally by the fatal shock of the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote. Although at the time it was possible to varnish over the first thin cracks made by the, quote, 100 Flowers, end quote, campaign and so fool the superficial observer, the crack widened until it became the open breach of the, quote, Great Leap Forward, end quote, and the final explosion of the, quote, Cultural Revolution. The sudden ending of the, quote, 100 Flowers destroyed, once and for all, the liberal illusions thanks to which the first years of the regime had been a period of enthusiasm and intense energy. The regime thus utterly alienated the support of the intellectuals. In the short run, the consequences of this might appear to have been slight. The intellectual elite represented only a slender minority within the population as a whole, but this alienation set a direction for Maoism which in the long run would be fatal to Maoism. The, quote, 100 Flowers, end quote, brought to an end Mao's constructive and revolutionary phase and opened the period of negative and retrograde activity. The repression that Mao would from now on mete out to all vital and outward-looking forces of criticism and modernization is an echo of the blindly reactionary policy of the Dowager Empress Cixi. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Cixi, as she strove in the decline of the Manchu dynasty to exterminate the small elite of progressive intellectuals and disseminators of modern ideas. Didn't Mao, I think, is there a quote from Mao that Mao killed more intellectuals than some emperor? I don't fucking know. This parallel between Mao and Cixi should not be understood as wholly offensive to the former. Cixi was anything but a mediocre personality. In fact, Cixi had a brilliant political sense. For her, the tragedy and the catastrophe she brought upon China came from the fact that this sense, which was perfectly well adapted to the parameters of her traditional and exclusive world, was lost in the new world which a twist in the path of history had confronted her with. Nor is this comparison an arbitrary one. To some extent it was suggested by the Maoists themselves. In the notorious controversy that grew around the film's secret episode at Qing Court, Qing Kong Mi Shi, see below, page 65, in the Maoist own judgment on this crisis in the Susi reign, it was the primitive and superstitious Boxer movement, mobilized by the Dowager Empress herself, which was the revolutionary force, while Kwang Su and the group of progressive intellectuals crushed by Susi were in the traitors' camp. A further important consequence of the, quote, 100 Flowers experiment was the evidence of a split between Mao and Mao's faithful collaborators and henchmen. For the first time, they found his judgment lacking. For the first time, they had been more far-sighted than he, and once the damage had been done, it was their effort that had to be mobilized in order to redress the situation. Mao would never be able to forgive them for having rescued him, and they would never be able to forget this near disaster. From now on, they were watching their leader with astonishment and dismay. Their dismay was to have the worst possible confirmation a year later with the launching of the, quote, Great Leap Forward, end quote, a movement which even more appallingly crystallized the most negative and destructive forces of Mao's ego, the poetic subjectivity of an aesthete and revisionary unaware of the limitations of everyday life, the inspired artist's impatience with unyielding matter, a willful idealism which seems to use a kind of mystical energy to control science and technology, a peasant hostility towards modernization, and a systematic reference to all the most archaic and backward aspects of life at the Chinese grassroots. Three themes in Mao's thinking give us a clue to the philosophy of the Great Leap Forward. 1. China's strength lies in her poverty. China is a, quote, blank page, end quote, lying open to Mao's inspirations so that Mao may paint upon it the unspoken poem of his revolution. Footnote, quote, the two most obvious characteristics of the 600 million Chinese are first their destitution and secondly their ingenuousness. This latter is not a bad thing. On the contrary, it's an advantage. Ingenuousness, not ingenuousness, ingenuousness. At this extreme point, change must necessarily come. One must act to make the revolution. A blank page is free of ornament. It invites one to inscribe the newest and most beautiful words, to paint the newest and most beautiful picture, end quote. Mao. End footnote. 2. Revolutionary fervor alone can and must effectively overcome material obstacles and so transform matter, the primacy of the, quote, red, end quote, over the, quote, expert, end quote. 3. The villager's gift for improvisation and native, quote, make do and mend, end quote, can and must effectively replace the scientific, technical, and industrial means. In fact, these are the age-old recipes of the guerrilla warfare which was conducted in the early isolation of China's inland provinces, and which in the past had brought Mao his most resounding victories. But Mao had by now lost sight of the fact that the problems Mao faced in building a modern China in the 1950s were radically different, and it was here that Mao's thinking revealed its pathetically out-of-date character, and his desperate hanging on to his old fighting formula, the only one that he really knew, ill at ease and out of his depth when confronted with the authority of, quote, specialists, end quote, when problems were set out in economic and technological terms that were new and, for him, alien. He sought to bring the struggle back at any price to the only terrain familiar to him, the countryside, the scene of the epic years of his youth. He preferred to slow down and hold up his country's development rather than see it escape his control. He not only brought it to a standstill, but deliberately took it backwards. The idea of China's, quote, destitution and, quote, blank pages, while applicable to some extent to the areas in which communist guerrilla fighters had operated 40 years earlier, could clearly not cope with the genuinely complex realities of China as a whole. And the principal obstacle that Mao's thinking encountered stemmed precisely from the fact that the page was not, quote, blank, end quote. Rather than Maoism being adapted to the reality of China, the reality of China was forced to adapt itself to Maoism. As a result, the only truly cultural part of the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, was to consist, as we shall see further on, of an immense effort to paste over, rub out, or scratch away from the Chinese, quote, page, end quote, the countless rich and living traces that the centuries had left on it, so that on the, quote, blank page, in the, quote, blank, end quote, page, the chairman could write his poem and his wife find a stage for her famous piano. Originally, the idea of making up for the lack of modern equipment by indigenous local improvisation and for want of anything better, resorting to a full range of makeshifts grew out of an intelligent and realistic policy. In an emergency, it produced remarkable results. The revolutionaries were rightly proud of having marched barefoot to victory, and their poverty had an extra dimension to their heroism. All this falls within the positive and creative phase of Maoism, but where Maoism begins its senile and retrograde phase is when shortages are presented as advantages and underdevelopment as a positive factor, and when the ingenious makeshift is no longer considered as a temporarily better than nothing, but as the ideal solution, and is deliberately preferred to the scientific solution of the, quote, experts, end quote. In the, quote, Great Leap Forward, end quote, Mao is concerned both to lead China back to this archaic parochial model, the epic battleground of his youth, and at the same time to catapult China ahead of all modern nations. This fantastic contradictory dream brought about the catastrophe. Not only did the movement fail to achieve the exhilarating aims the movement had set itself, but the entire Chinese economy was plunged into chaos when the construction effort met paralysis and breakdown. Natural catastrophes followed to complete the disaster. The population, already exhausted by the frenzied and fruitless efforts enforced upon it, began to experience the miseries of famine. The credit and prestige that the party had gained among the peasants suffered irreparable damage, and the regime's authority was directly threatened by the discontent and despair of the masses. There was consternation in the party's upper levels at this new lurch in policy, which was infinitely more serious than the, quote, 100 flowers, end quote, and was due once again to one of Mao's irresponsible initiatives. This time it was important to take emergency measures to save the regime and to prevent any repetition of such hazardous ventures. In December 1958, at the Wuchang Conference, Mao was forced to relinquish his position as head of state in favor of Liu Shaoqi. The decision became official in March 1959. The Shanghai Conference, 7th Plenum of the 8th Central Committee, April 1959, produced a first critical examination of the Great Leap Forward, and a first series of amendments was made to the idea of the people's communions. The party apparatus thus began to impress upon Mao the weight of its disapproval, but did not express its displeasure by means of a direct attack. This, however, was to come immediately afterwards. It was led by Marshal Peng Te-Huai and culminated in the famous Lushan Conference of July-August 1959. Peng Te-Huai was a formidable individual. There is a vivid character sketch of Peng and a fairly complete biographical sketch in Edgar Snow's Red Star over China. In 1961, Edgar Snow, in The Other Side of the River, took the trouble to deny outright that Peng had organized a plot against Mao 2 years earlier, or that Peng had been punished. Quote, the Chinese party leadership does not work that way, end quote, Edgar Snow. The implication being that the paying off of old scores in this way could not exist in such an admirable ruling elite, and must therefore necessarily be the product of the perverse imagination of the foreign press. In fact, 2 years earlier, on the 16th of August 1959, the Central Committee had unmistakably denounced Peng as the leader of an, quote, anti-party plot, end quote. Unfortunately for... I'm going to read that because it's in italics. In fact, 2 years earlier, on the 16th of August 1959, the Central Committee had unmistakably denounced Peng as the leader of a, quote, anti-party plot, end quote. Unfortunately for Mr. Edgar Snow, the Central Committee document which set out his crime, decision of the 8th plenary session of the 8th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party concerning the anti-party group led by Peng Te-Huai, unfortunately for Mr. Snow, the Central Committee document which sets out his crime was titled, quote, Decision of the 8th Plenary Decision of the 8th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party concerning the anti-party group led by Peng Te-Huai. Was finally made public on Peking's initiative. See the People's Daily, 16th of August, 1967. Mr. Snow can justly flatter himself on being one of the best informed foreign observers and one of the most experienced witnesses of Chinese communism, but that Edgar Snow should have blundered so ingenuously and so thoroughly gives food for thought on the quality of Western information on the problem of China. Peng Te-Huai, let me see if I can... I did take time to look up Peng Te-Huai. Peng Te-Huai lived from 1898 to 1974 and was a Chinese general and China's Minister of National Defense from 1954 to 1959. Peng Dehuai was born into a poor peasant family and received several years of primary education before his family's poverty forced him to suspend his education at the age of 10 and to work for several years as a manual laborer. When Peng Dehuai was 16, Peng became a professional soldier. Over the next 10 years, Peng served in the armies of several Hunan-based warlord armies, raising himself from the rank of private class to major. In 1926, Peng Dehuai's forces joined the Kuomintang, and Peng was first introduced to communism. Peng Dehuai participated in the Northern Expedition and supported Wang Jingwei's attempt to form a left-leaning Kuomintang government based in Wuhan. After Wang was defeated, Peng briefly joined Chiang Kai-shek's forces before joining the Chinese Communist Party, allying himself with Mao Zedong and Zhu De. Peng was one of the most senior generals who defended the Jiangxi Soviet from Chiang's attempt to capture it, and his success was rivaled only by Lin Biao. Peng participated in the Long March and supported Mao Zedong in the Zunyi Conference, which was critical to Mao's rise to power. During the 1937 to 1945 Second Sino-Japanese War, Peng was one of the strongest supporters of pursuing a ceasefire with the Kuomintang and the Kuomintang, I can't pronounce it right, Kuomintang, in order to concentrate China's collective resources on resisting the Japanese Empire. Peng was the senior commander in the combined Kuomintang communist efforts to resist the Chinese occupation in Shanxi in 1937, and by 1938 was in command of two-thirds of the 8th Route Army. In 1940, Peng conducted the 100 Regiments Offensive, a massive communist effort to disrupt Japanese logistical networks across northern China. The 100 Regiments Offensive was modestly successful, but political disputes within the Communist Party led to Peng being recalled to Yan'an, and he spent the rest of the war without an active command. After the Japanese surrendered in 1945, Peng was given command of communist forces in northwest China. Peng was the most senior commander responsible for defending the communist leadership in Shanxi from Kuomintang forces, saving Mao from being captured at least once. Peng eventually defeated the Kuomintang and northwest China, captured huge amounts of military supplies, and actively incorporated the huge area, including Xinjiang, into the People's Republic of China. Peng was one of the few senior military leaders who supported Mao's suggestion to involve China directly in the 1950 to 1953 Korean War, and Peng served as the direct commander of the Chinese People's Voluntary Army for the first half of the war, though Mao and Zhou Enlai were technically more senior. Peng's experiences in the Korean War convinced Peng that the Chinese military had to become more professional, organized, and well-equipped in order to prepare itself for the conditions of modern technical warfare. Because the Soviet Union was the only communist country then equipped with a fully modern professional army, Peng attempted to reform China's military on the Soviet model over the next several years, making the army less political and more professional, contrary to the political goals of Mao. Peng resisted Mao's attempts to develop a personality cult throughout the 1950s, and when Mao's economic policies associated with the Great Leap Forward caused a nationwide famine, Peng Dehuai became critical of Mao's leadership. The rivalry between Peng and Mao culminated in an open confrontation between the two at the 1959 Lushan Conference. Mao won this confrontation, labeled Peng as a leader of a, quote, anti-party clique, end quote, and purged Peng from all influential positions for the rest of his life. Peng lived in virtual obscurity until 1965, when the reformers Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping supported Peng's limited return to government, developing military industries in southwest China. In 1966, following the advent of the Cultural Revolution, Peng was arrested by Red Guards. From 1966 to 1970, radical factions within the CCP, led by Lin Biao and Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, singled out Peng for national persecution, and Peng was publicly humiliated in numerous large-scale struggle sessions and subjected to physical and psychological torture in organized efforts to force Peng to confess his, quote, crimes, end quote, against Mao Zedong and the Communist Party of China. In 1970, Peng was formally tried and sentenced to life imprisonment, and he died in prison in 1974. After Mao died in 1976, Peng's old ally, Deng Xiaoping, emerged as China's paramount leader. Deng led an effort to formally rehabilitate people who he believed had been unjustly persecuted during the Cultural Revolution, and Peng was one of the first leaders to be posthumously rehabilitated in 1978. In modern China, Peng is considered one of the most successful and highly respected generals in the history of the Communist Party of China. Anyway, Peng de Huai. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Let me see if I can. I don't know. Alright, I'm not going to look any more stuff up because it's too much. Peng de Huai was outspoken, warm-hearted, and truculent. His heroism and military genius had played a decisive role first in the Hunan Qiangzi guerrilla campaign, then in the success of the Long March. Among the masses, his prestige was almost legendary and nearly the equal of Mao's, while his popularity in the army was hardly less than that of Chu Tai. He would share his rations with his troops as if they were his family. Having learned all he knew from childhood upwards in the school of life, he was without any academic education and a lifelong stranger to the sophistications and tactical twists and turns of politics, in contrast to so many of his colleagues who, after the liberation, cut themselves off from the masses in order to enjoy all the privileges of a new bureaucratic class. Peng de Huai maintained his simple and frugal lifestyle and had remained in direct contact with the people. During the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, this austere style of living which he had always adopted and which had become a kind of reproach to the new ruling class was seen as one of his crimes, as yet another aspect of his, quote, hypocrisy, end quote. As for the military feats and heroism that had marked Peng de Huai's whole career, they were twisted against him as evidence that he was an, quote, opportunist, a, quote, ambitious adventurist, end quote, and a, quote, warlord, end quote. So it was he, Peng de Huai, more than any of the other dignitaries of the regime, who was in a position to hear the complaints of the peasants. He resolved to speak for them and to make their voice heard in the leader's ear. To do this, not only did he rely on his own position within the regime's apparatus, but above all, he maintained the simple man's belief that it should always be possible for former fighting companions to speak frankly. Quote, "Did we not eat from the same pot?" end quote, demanded Chu Tai later on as he pleaded Peng's case before the Central Committee. He could not understand why for Mao there could no longer be companions, only lackeys. This was to explain the extremely poor quality of the ruling team that emerged from the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, which was recruited by Mao from within his private circle. Chen Pota from the servants' quarters, Cheng Qing and Ye Chun from the women's quarters, Lin Biao and Huang Hengsheng from among the generals, and Kang Shang and Si Fuqi from among the policemen. Like I said, I don't know how to pronounce these names, and a lot of these names are spelled different now. In April 1959, during the preparatory session for the 8th plenum of the 8th Central Committee at Lushan, Peng circulated a memorandum which Peng had sent Mao, in which he bluntly criticized the policy of the, quote, Great Leap Forward, end quote, and Peng accused Mao of having erred towards, quote, subjectivism, end quote, and, quote, petty bourgeois idealism, end quote, in his line, and showed how his policy and its scorn for and ignorance of objective reality had laid an unbearable burden on the Chinese people. The growing disquiet and discontent which Mao's autocratic and foolhardy style of government had generated among the top leaders crystallized behind Peng's manifesto, which had dared to shout aloud with a brutal frankness that most of them believed in their heart of hearts. During the Lushan conference, Mao found that he was confronted by a formidable opposition. Peng's standing was high in the army, the party, and among the masses. Peng had held high office, standing in 14th place in the regime's hierarchy. Peng was a member of the Politburo, vice chairman of the State Council, and Minister of National Defense. Peng had the open support of other important figures such as Huang Keicheng, member of the Central Committee, Vice Minister of Defense, and Chief of the General Staff, and Chang Wen-tian, Deputy Politburo member and Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, as well as the tacit support of the majority of Central Committee members. At this critical juncture, in order to ward off the most pressing danger, Mao was forced to beg the help of his deputy, Liu Shaoqi, who controlled a good number of the levels of the bureaucracy, of the bureaucratic machine. Again, I don't know. I'm forgetting how to pronounce all these names. Liu thus found himself placed in the privileged position of arbiter. Liu manipulated the majority and had Peng, Huang, and Chang condemned and at once relieved of their party and government posts. But although in the event Mao was spared for the immediate future from the political death which would have sprung from his finding himself in a minority on the Central Committee, the price Mao had to pay in order to be rid of his most formidable opponents was nonetheless exorbitant: the transfer of power to Liu Shaoqi. A digression is called for at this stage. In order to prevent any misunderstanding and to kill outright a kind of Luist myth, which has gained credence in the West, it would be as pointless to try to find any trace of a, quote, ideological, end quote, confrontation or of a, quote, philosophic, end quote, contradiction between Mao Zedong and Liu Shaoqi, and it would have been to find one between, for example, de Gaulle and Pompidou. Liu's career had been that of a second-in-command who was somewhat colorless but devoted and deficient. The case later made against Liu Shaoqi by the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, consisted of such clumsy falsifications that they could hardly fool a child. For instance, the accusations consist either of fragmentary documents shorn of their context or of oral statements quoting unverifiable sources, all attempting to demonstrate that in the past Liu had adopted a treasonable policy in calling for collaboration with the Kuomintang, when in reality Liu had never done anything but docilely repeat Mao's instructions. In fact, this collaboration policy, which had been judged expedient for tactical reasons, was advocated with the greatest force by Mao himself in a celebrated article, quote, A New Stage, end quote, which was later withdrawn from circulation and carefully removed from the definitive collection of the selected works of Mao Zedong. The article was the text of a speech which Mao made to the sixth plenary session of the Sixth Central Committee in October 1938. It was initially considered as one of Mao's more important works. Anna Strong presented it then as one of his, quote, 6 great works, end quote. I have a piece by, I can't remember who actually, is it Jack Brad? I think might be the name, by Anna Louise Strong. About Anna Louise Strong by Jack Brad, who's from like a third camp socialist perspective, or a socialist who has a bureaucratic collectivist analysis of the USSR. On the eve of the liberation, it was republished in a separate edition by the New Democracy Publishing House, Hong Kong, 1948. After the liberation, it was completely withdrawn from circulation, and all traces of its existence were carefully rubbed out. Only one of its 8 chapters, number 7, was reprinted in the definitive edition of the selected works, and even this was unrecognizable. It had been submitted to a considerable amount of alteration, and its title had been transformed into, quote, The Place of the Chinese Communist Party in the National War, end quote. The original text, now prohibited, spoke about Chiang Kai-shek in terms of the utmost respect, eulogizing Chiang Kai-shek as the, quote, supreme leader of the nation, end quote. He spoke of the, quote, bright future of the Kuomintang, and, end quote, the, quote, bright future of the Kuomintang, and, end quote, and made exhortations such as the following, quote, Let us all, with unanimous sincerity, support President Cheng. Let us support the national government. Let us support the collaboration between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. Let us oppose all enemy undertakings which are harmful to this collaboration of the Communist Party with President Cheng and the national government, end quote. Mao praised, quote, the united leadership of the supreme leader of the nation and the supreme generalissimo, President Cheng, end quote. And, quote, the republic based on the 3 principles of the people, end quote. There's a footnote here. See, for instance, Mao's report to the second session of the 7th Central Committee. Quote, for a long period after the victory of the revolution, it will be necessary to make a maximum use of all the positive aspects of private capitalist enterprise in the cities and in the countryside to benefit the development of the national economy. During this period, all the private capitalist elements which are not harmful to the national economy and which are useful to it should be allowed to survive and to develop. ... We must treat the great majority of Democrats outside the party as if they were our own cadres. ... We must give them work and entrust them with responsibility and authority, end quote. Mao Zedong, end footnote. Liu was accused of connivance with Soviet revisionism. The accusers forgot that it was under Liu's, quote, reign, end quote, that the break with the Soviet Union was completed. This notion of Liu's, quote, revisionism, end quote, is a fanciful myth, a complete forgery and a clumsy forgery at that, used in, quote, cultural revolution, end quote, propaganda. It can never stand up to the slightest attempt at historical analysis. But since Western commentators of this current Chinese scene are in no way concerned to apply historical analysis, the myth is generally accepted, and it was helped by the sheer volume of sound with which Peking's loudspeakers boldly and endlessly repeated it. Incidentally, it is at this point that those observers most hostile to the Peking regime meet Western Maoists in a common gullibility. The latter see Liu's, quote, revisionism, end quote, as a sign of dastardly criminality, and the former suddenly discover in it an indication of liberal virtues. Both thereby at a stroke, and under the influence of the falsifications of the, quote, cultural revolution, end quote, forget all they previously knew about Liu's personality and actions. If the, quote, cultural revolution, end quote, had genuinely been a struggle against revisionism, the group it should logically have brought down was not that of Zhou Enlai and Li Xinyan, who in fact emerged from the whole affair in the stronger position, and nobody would have thought of taking up the names of Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. I think that's Deng Xiaoping. It's spelled Tenghsiaoping here. So Deng Xiaoping to this concept of liberal pragmatism. Liu's team has all along been associated with the Stalinism of the purest, narrowest, and most sectarian kind. By what miracle has he now been transformed, Liu Shaoqi, been transformed into a sort of Chinese Dubček? Dubček was the leader of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party, I believe, in the period of Alexander Dubček, in the period of the Prague Spring. Any attempt to outline a Liuist philosophy with a specific content in opposition to Mao's thought must inevitably fail, for the simple reason that a Liuist philosophy has never existed. A Liuist philosophy has never existed. Apart from the official communications and various speeches for which Liu Shaoqi functions simply as a transmission belt for the orders of his master, he has written only one theoretical work, quote, How to be a Good Communist, end quote, Lu Kengqing An Tang Yuan Ti Shu Yang Yenan. This slender work is leaden of expression. Unlike Mao, Liu is by contrast a man of only mediocre literary culture. And full and dull of content. Were it absolutely necessary to credit it with an ideological line, it could best be described as a child's guide to the Stalinist virtues of discipline and blind obedience, all perfectly natural in a work coming from Mao's immediate circle. This would give food for thought to credulous Westerners who imagine that a China led by Liu rather than Mao would take the primrose path of, quote, revisionism, end quote. They forget that China was in effect under Liu's leadership from 1959 to 1965, where then were the primroses. The child's guide in question was, incidentally, so utterly orthodox that it appeared with Mao's approval, was constantly republished and remained over a quarter of a century a standard work and recommended reading for all members of the party without anyone ever realizing that it was a, quote, poisonous weed, end quote. The thought of Liu Shaoqi did not appear so, quote, poisonous, end quote, at the outset, since Mao himself did the honor of quoting it, and the quotation was reproduced again in the 1966 version of Mao Shu Shi Yu Liu. The theory of blind obedience contained in it was condemned during the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote. Not on principle, but because it came from Liu. The, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, recommended precisely this kind of blind obedience towards Mao. See, for example, the article by Wu Weitung in the Liberation Army Daily, which was reprinted by the New China News Agency on the 30th of October, 1967. One must resolutely obey the thought of Chairman Mao and resolutely oppose everything that goes against it. Chairman Mao's instructions must be obeyed even when they are not understood. Even when they are not understood. If you don't know, if you've never listened to a video by me before, I repeat things that are italicized. The Navy's oath of allegiance to Mao, taken at the beginning of December 1967, is similar. Quote, "We shall follow closely step by step. We shall grasp in all its depth. We shall apply phrase by phrase and word by word every instruction from Chairman Mao. Those which we understand we shall carry out. Those which we do not understand we shall also carry out resolutely. And in the process of carrying them out we shall deepen our understanding. We shall make the thought of Chairman Mao the substance of our souls, so that it commands each nerve, each movement." End quote. Liu Shaoqi was accused of wanting to use his theory of obedience to transform the party members into docile tools. The troubles and difficulties that the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, was to encounter in making out a case against Liu are instructive. The true reasons for purging him would not be mentioned, for they were connected with the, quote, Great Leap Forward, end quote, controversy, and on that point a catalogue of Liu's, quote, crimes, end quote, would all too probably make Liu more popular among the masses. It was only possible to use outlandish and futile pretexts, for example, the film's secret episode of the Qing court, or to falsify past incidents. The latter task was a particularly delicate one. A case against Liu based on facts from the past would in fact be the equivalent of a case against Mao, since the words and actions of one had always in the press been closely taken for those of the other, Liu having never been anything more than Mao's tame spokesman and henchman. The well-known opinion of another head of state concerning his chief minister comes to mind. Quote, "Having long tested his worth and his devotion, I have judged him capable and worthy of undertaking this high office. He is inclined by nature." I'm trying to make sure this is referring to Liu. "Having long tested Liu's worth and Liu's devotion, I have judged Liu capable of and worthy of undertaking his high office. Liu is inclined by nature to consider the practical side of affairs. While revering brilliance in action, risk in enterprise, and daring in authority, Liu tends to be cautious in his attitudes and reserved in his bearing, and excels in covering all the aspects of any problem and in clearing the way for a solution. Thus it is that this newcomer to public life finds himself suddenly, by my action, and without having sought it, invested with an office of boundless scope, ... protected from above and supported from below, but in addition trusting in himself, notwithstanding Liu's natural discretion. Liu gets to grips with the problem." End quote. De Gaulle's judgment of Pompidou is much like the judgment that Mao might have expressed concerning Liu. The working of the relationships between the two pairs, relationships which first drew them together, then drove them apart, shows a remarkable parallelism. In neither case did ideology play any part. It was therefore out of the question that the disciple who had usurped his master's place should disown his master's philosophy. That would have been to saw off the branch that supported him. In each pair there is a man of genius who is nevertheless out of his time, an egocentric who can tolerate neither criticism nor contradiction, a creator inspired by a historic culture but ignorant of, quote, management, end quote, problems, impatient and cursory in his approach to the technical trivia of administration, organization, and detailed performance. This man discovers a devoted follower, a Sancho Panza, whose zeal is total, who owes to his master all that he is and all that he owns, who is all submissiveness, no dreamer but a doer, so good a doer that he soon makes himself indispensable and ends by taking over and meticulously controlling the complex machinery of government, which his master will now touch only with clumsy irritation. The daily practice of politics at the working level and the practical experience of finding concrete solutions to the concrete problems keeps his feet on the ground, and he is in close touch with the ever-changing reality of men and circumstances, while his master, freed from these mundane tasks, can withdraw into his visionary world. A crisis occurs. The follower now sees his master, in spite of all his exhortations, tilting disastrously at windmills, and suddenly discovering the extent both of the latter's aberrations and of his own talents. What was Liu Shaoqi going to do now that he was at the helm? Above all, nothing that might directly affect the Maoist continuity on which Liu Shaoqi's own credibility rested and which legitimized Liu Shaoqi's power. The history of the Taiping insurrection provides an interesting historical parallel to this kind of muffled takeover within a political movement, where there is no change in the general ideological line. Yang Su-ching, an executive who was capable but had no personal vision, ended up by restricting Hung Chang, the brilliant, inspired but light-headed leader, to a symbolic and isolated position as a prophet while he took over all the real power himself. Hung, like Mao with his, quote, cultural revolution, end quote, later made a successful counterattack, but his fight to regain power involved such a wide-scale purge of the movement's ruling elite that this hemorrhage precipitated the ultimate ruin of his own regime. This explains the official condemnation of Peng Te Hoi, or Hai line. Peng Te Hoi line. Can't never say that fucking right. Peng De Hai. I can't fucking pronounce the name. Huai. Peng De Huai. That's how I'm gonna say it. Okay. Peng De Huai's line, as well as the maintenance of Mao as chairman of the party's Central Committee. This is a purely formal position. The real authority lies not with the chairman, but with the secretary, who at the same time was Deng Xiaoping. But Liu had come to power in order to solve an urgent crisis which was threatening the very survival of the regime. Liu Shaoqi was in a better position than anyone to know that Peng's description of the catastrophic results of the, quote, Great Leap Forward, end quote, was not a, quote, counter-revolutionary calumny, end quote, but a realistic diagnosis of the situation. Liu is an apparatchik from top to toe. Above all, he wanted to save the regime. Liu Shaoqi was therefore forced to tack from one side to the other. At all costs, Liu Shaoqi had to avoid any premature, spectacular de-Maoization, which is what Peng's crude and maladroit initiative had threatened to stir up, for this could have deprived the regime, which had already been dangerously shaken, of the regime's credibility in the eyes of the country. The regime's, quote, cement, end quote. But on the other hand, he had to backtrack immediately and get the country out of the wild lurch of the Great Leap Forward. In other words, he had to admit, in fact, that Peng was right and neutralize Mao's initiative, but as a matter of form, Liu Shaoqi had to condemn Peng and safeguard Mao's prestige. He executed this double maneuver with great skill. The political line of Peng, Huang, and Chang was officially denounced at the end of the Lushan Conference, and Peng was forced to humiliate himself publicly by writing Mao a letter confessing to his faults and humbly begging his pardon. But it is a remarkable feature of the affair that neither Peng, Huang, nor Chang were subjected to any punishment. They were discharged from their effective functions in the party, army, and government, but were allowed to retain their respective titles of member of the Politburo. Peng, deputy member of the Politburo. Chang, respective titles of member of the Politburo, Peng, deputy member of the Politburo, Chang, and member of the Central Committee, Huang. This degree of clemency seems extraordinary when one compares it with the fate previously meted out to the rebellion of Cao Kang and Zhao Shuxi, for example, and one considers the seriousness of the facts. One gets a good idea of the extent to which When one considers the seriousness of the facts, one gets a good idea of the extent to which Peng's views had found support in the Central Committee. Peng had already been assured of large-scale support before the Lushan Conference. It was on the 16th of June, in fact, that Wu Han, under the pseudonym of Liu Mianqi, had published his resounding article, Hai Zhui Reprimands the Emperor, a transparent historical parable in which Peng could be recognized beneath the features of Hai Zhu and the upright and courageous Ming, a civil servant, who dared to plead to the Emperor Chia Qing on behalf of the oppressed peasants. This article appeared in no less a place than the People's Daily, the regime's official organ. In other words, the party's central organs, and above all the propaganda department, which is one of its more sensitive, not to say sore points, had already been largely won over to Peng's views and supported his denunciation of Mao's mistakes. There's a footnote here that I missed. Peng retired for a while to Peng's native province of Hunan. By the eve of the Cultural Revolution, Peng had found an official post again, though a very lowly post. Peng was third deputy director of the construction committee of the Central Committee's Southwestern Bureau. Chang Wen-tian was rehabilitated in 1962 as a special research assistant at the Institute of Economic Research in the Academy of Sciences. Huang Ke-cheng had reestablished himself in a more spectacular way, and on the outbreak of the Cultural Revolution, he held the post of deputy governor of the province of Shenxi. From the beginning of 1967 onwards, they were once again stripped of their functions, and all three were pilloried. End footnote. No less remarkable is the fact that the official disgrace of Peng and Peng's associates did not involve any silencing of their various supporters, who soon made themselves heard once more, and with a growing audacity and eloquence. Peng's disgrace thus afforded Mao scant satisfaction for his self-respect. This was emphasized at the same time by what happened on the solid terrain of the political measures that were adopted. The Lushan Conference soon produced an official confirmation of Peng's criticisms. In its communiqué of the 26th of August, it admitted that the statistics previously published on the economic results of the first year of the Great Leap had been artificially inflated by between 40 and 50%, and in particular that the grain harvest had only been 250 million tons, a statistic which was itself probably inflated, as against the 375 million previously proclaimed. An even more serious setback for Mao was the fact that the Lushan Conference completely removed the mystique concerning the, quote, Great Leap, and deprived the new institutions which it had tried to impose of their original content. The institutions which it had tried to impose of their original content. The, quote, People's Communes, end quote, were gradually reduced to mere administrative organs, while the People's Communes' functions and production were transferred to the lower level of the, quote, brigade, and later to be even the lower unit of the, quote, production team, end quote. From the beginning of 1961, after the decision of the 9th plenary session of the 8th Central Committee meeting to make official the amendments to the, quote, Great Leap, end quote, and the communes, all that remained of the old Maoist initiative was simply the name, devoid of any real content. It should not be thought that by dismantling the whole, quote, Great Leap Forward, end quote, movement, Liu Shaoqi had deviated ideologically and had taken a, quote, revisionist, end quote, route. I repeat again, the problem was not in the least an ideological problem. The problem was simply a crude choice of life or death of the regime. It was a matter of extreme urgency to take some concrete steps, whatever those concrete steps were, to rescue the economic situation and reactivate the production of basic foodstuffs in order to feed a population that had reached the point of despair as a result of their excessive deprivation. I don't know if he's going to use the word. I don't know if he's. I haven't. I stopped reading this and I started reading it again a couple of days later. I don't know if he's mentioned famine again. I don't know. I've heard by them. What's his name? Felix Wimhoyer, that's what I was thinking of. Felix Wimhoyer's YouTube channel, which I highly recommend, talks about the global Maoism. And he talks about how one of the things that probably diminished like the appeal of Maoism went from what it's a peak in the 1960s and 70s. One of the causes that he thinks was a contributed to this was the I think they confirmed the existence of the famine due to like statistical information from the late 1950s and early 1960s, and noticed that there was like that the population figures or something like didn't add up, and that's how they kind of like estimated the extent of the famine that had taken place in the with the Great Leap Forward. So like if he's writing this, I think he's writing this book in like the early 70s, late 60s. I think that the extent of the famine might not have been well known at this point. But this about turn was not in itself sufficient for Liu Shaoqi. He still had to consolidate the power which he had acquired, and above all to prevent once and for all any threat from Mao Zedong that Mao Zedong might lapse back into some of his, quote, lyrical improvisations, end quote. Mao thus found himself gradually restricted to the role of some kind of ancient totem. Everyone genuflected to Mao, but Mao was completely powerless in his wooden immobility. Proof of the fact that retirement had been very effectively imposed on him is supplied once again by the, quote, Cultural Revolution. In Deng Xiaoping's confession of his, quote, crimes, which was extorted from him during the, quote, Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping admitted that over this whole period, Deng Xiaoping had settled all the party's affairs directly without ever referring them to Mao. And in a remarkable speech in 1967, Mao recalled this state of isolation and impotence to which he had been reduced, and he could not even publish articles defending his own positions in the official Peking press. He finally had to fall back on a Shanghai paper, Wen Hui Pao, to publish the famous article by Yao Wen Yuan on the 10th of November 1965, which lit the fuse of the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, though even this demanded the use of many ruses and diversions. And the whole history of the preparation and initial steps of the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, which I shall later outline, adequately illustrates the extraordinary difficulties which Mao encountered at the start of his attempt to regain power, and shows precisely how real his enforced withdrawal had been between 1959 and 1965. In order to make himself more secure, Liu Shaoqi strengthened his own team. For example, he got Liu Tingyi and Luo Zhuqing onto the secretary and the Central Committee. At the same time, Liu Shaoqi eventually took over the criticisms which Peng had made of the, quote, Great Leap, and announced in January 1962 to an enlarged working session of the 8th Central Committee, the so-called, quote, Conference of 7,000, end quote, the Great Leap, end quote, was launched too hastily and lacked balance. After 3 years of Great Leap, some 8 to 10 years of hard work will be required in order to clean up the mess. At this rate, it is not really worth it. The people's communes were premature. The backyard furnaces in the countryside produced nothing. There were serious economic and financial difficulties. Too much energy has been wasted. It will be difficult to get back to normal even in 7 or 8 years, end quote. Liu Shaoqi. From the end of 1959 to the end of 1962, the party authorities consolidated the normalization process by filling in the cracks opened up by the, quote, Great Leap, end quote, warding off any risk of a return to light-headed Maoist improvisation. They did not hesitate to enlist the collaboration of the intellectuals. An ambiguous kind of, quote, thaw, end quote, prevailed during these years, ambiguous because it was the result of a quite temporary union of interests which in the long term were still irreconcilable. For the intellectuals, the free pursuit of truth and the denunciation of tyranny and the mendacity continued an absolute and permanent mission. For the ruling group, it was simply a question of mobilizing these voices for a limited and concrete tactical aim. On the one hand, to discredit the autocratic and subjective political line of Mao Zedong for good, and on the other hand, to set in motion once more the scientific activity in the universities which had been paralyzed by the, quote, Great Leap, so that the country would again have the, quote, experts who were needed for the modern development of China and whom Mao had so stupidly thought he could do without. It would therefore be a complete mistake to deduce that Liu Shaoqi nourished a real desire to, quote, liberalize, end quote, intellectual life. Such a desire would not have fitted in with Liu Shaoqi's strictly Stalinist career, and it corresponded even less to the style of such dogmatic and sectarian bureaucrats as Liu Tingyi and Chou Yang, whom Liu had confirmed in their post as the dictators of arts and letters. As soon as these tactical aims had been achieved, from the end of 1962, Liu Shaoqi's administration did not hesitate to put the muzzle back on the intellectuals and send the intellectuals back to their kennel. But the voices which the intellectuals had raised in the meantime were not forgotten so quickly. Let us leave aside the discussions on philosophical and literary theory and the university work on classical studies, history, literature, philosophy, fine arts, archaeology, etc. The astonishing outburst which occurred during this short truce is enough to make one dream. What an influence contemporary China could have on world culture if only its potential for intelligence, knowledge, and talent could be freely and fully employed. Achievements in this sphere do not fall within the scope of this present inquiry. Let us look instead at work of a directly political and polemical nature. Two personalities in particular catch the attention both for their talent and their boldness, Wu Han and Teng Tou. It is perhaps no exaggeration to say that to future historians who approach this period of bureaucratic tyranny, people such as Wu Han and above all Teng Tou will appear as those who throughout these shameful years really saved the honor and dignity of the Chinese intellectuals. The price that they eventually had to pay was heavy. They knew this in advance, but they did not shirk their mission. Teng Tou took as his moral pattern the scholars of Tung Lin, a group of intellectuals at the close of the Ming period, who risked the worst kinds of torture by making political criticisms of a corrupt imperial regime, and foresaw his own destiny in the following lines. Quote, "Do not believe that men who wield the pen only know how to chatter emptily. When they are under the executioner's axe, they know how to show their red blood," end quote. After Wu Han's short article of 1959, quote, titled "Hai Zhu Reprimands the Emperor," in 1960 he composed the libretto for a classical Peking opera, The Dismissal of Hai Zhu. The historical figure of Hai Zhu, 1515 to 1587, who was dismissed from his post by the emperor because he had taken the side of the oppressed peasantry, served once more as a covering name for Peng Te Huai. The libretto, in fact, appeared as a plea for his rehabilitation, resorting to historical parables in order to criticize the present as a Chinese tradition, which is as old as historiography itself. Even the Chronicles of Spring and Autumns, which is attributed to Confucius, was read by the old commentators as a kind of coded message, with each word concealing scathing judgments on political morality. Through centuries of autocracy and imperial censorship, Chinese scholars have had little more than this with which to challenge orthodoxy and make unconventional opinions heard. This form of parable, which is the traditional weapon of Chinese polemics, was used with a superior dexterity and verve in the political writings of Teng To from the beginning of 1961 until September 1962. Teng To published a series of short articles in various Peking newspapers: Pai Ching, Ji Pao, Pai Ching, Wan Pao, Quang Ming, Ji Pao, and the periodical Qian Xian, or Chen Xian. Under the guise of moral fables and historical anecdotes, sometimes serious, sometimes humorous, literary and artistic commentaries, and various other pieces, they present a devastating critique of Maoism. These articles deal with a wide range of issues, but certain broad themes can be distinguished. A plea for the rehabilitation of Peng Te Huai under the guise of Peng De Huai A plea for the rehabilitation of Peng De Huai under the guise of sketches of various historical figures who had incurred the displeasure of the sovereign by attempting to alleviate the sufferings of the people. B. Attacks against the person and style of Mao, Mao's taste for hollow slogans, Mao's tendency to substitute words for reality, Mao's thirst for personal glory, Mao's vanity, Mao's intolerance of criticism, Mao's lack of realism, Mao's inability to listen to the advice of competent people, Mao's blind obstinacy. It is false that Mao is a, quote, great man, end quote. Mao is a, quote, whining chuk liang, a quote, whining chuk liang, end quote, an amnesiac who forgets his own promises and goes back on his word. He should, as a matter of urgency, quote, keep quiet and take a rest, end quote, or he will find that his psychologically unbalanced nature has turned to, quote, wild insanity, end quote. C. A criticism of the Maoist political line. Mao, with his subjective and arbitrary political line, resembles the emperors of former times surrounded by the emperor's little circle of corrupt eunuchs. His policies are worked out without any consideration for suggestions from the base, and he ignores and despises the opinion of the masses. Lacking specialized knowledge and practical experience, Mao pursues unrealizable chimeras. Mao substitutes trickery for real intelligence and practices a despotism which is based on violence and coercion, in defiance of the principles of social and political morality. D. A criticism of the, quote, Great Leap Forward. This was carried through without any consideration for the natural limits of human strength and imposed too heavy a burden on the peasants. Mao's dream of a fantastic multiplication of a modest initial capital merely led to the evaporation of this capital. Illusion was substituted for reality as the point of departure, and an unrealistic, quote, moral factor, end quote, was substituted for objective material conditions, so that the whole enterprise came up against a wall of realities. E. On the positive side, Teng To reminded the intellectuals of their responsibilities and their mission. The intellectuals' duty was to right wrongs, as the wandering knights used to do. The intellectuals had to shout the truth aloud and, quote, meet the tyranny of the wicked with indomitable resistance, end quote, even at the risk of their lives. They had to remain attentive to the world around them, and politics had to remain their constant concern. Their studies and their teaching had to be opened to political commitment. In their writings, they had to learn every means possible of making truth heard, or directly or indirectly. Together with these public attacks, a secret burying operation began, which was even bolder and more serious, and was aimed at destroying Mao's political existence once and for all. This was the famous Chang Quan Lu affair, the details of which were first revealed by the Cultural Revolution. Under the aegis of Peng Chen, who was mayor of Peking, secretary of the Peking Municipal Party Committee, member of the Politburo, and secretary to the Secretariat of the 8th Central Committee, a small working group met in Chang Quan Lu, a park in West Peking, to make a secret, detailed, critical re-examination of Mao's policy of recent years, and particularly of the Great Leap Forward. By gathering together the conclusions of inquiries conducted during the campaign, and by analyzing the documents of the central organs of the party, they compiled a dossier on Mao's mistakes. Peng Chen gave Teng To the job of organizing the dossier. Mao had already been removed from the levers of power, and now, while still alive, he was about to suffer the fate which Stalin had encountered after his death. But this final step was never actually taken. The dossier was not used at the famous Conference of the 7,000 of January 1962, for which it had been prepared. At this gathering, Liu Shaoqi was content to castigate the failure of the Great Leap without transforming his criticism into a public trial of Mao himself. As I have already pointed out, Liu was an apparatchik par excellence. Liu was afraid that such a trial would shake the entire system, and above all that it would endanger Liu Shaoqi's own position. All his political credibility sprang from the sole fact that Liu Shaoqi was Mao's right arm and successor, and any attack against Mao would necessarily ricochet against Liu Shaoqi's self. The fact that there might have been some divergence between Liu's prudence and the extreme attitude of Peng is further suggested by the striking difference between the relentless fate meted out to Peng during the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, and the relative circumspection with which Liu was treated. There was something else hampering the Demaoization process. Although he had been deprived of direct power, Mao's prestige remained considerable, and certain by no means important quarters were faithful to Mao. During the, quote, Conference of the 7,000, end quote, 2 defense counsels supported Mao against the criticisms coming from the apparatus. Lin Biao and Chou Enlai. Several years later, the Cultural Revolution rewarded both Chou Enlai and Lin Biao for refusing to desert Mao in this tight spot. In particular, this act of personal fidelity on Mao's part explains to a large extent the astonishing immunity with which he succeeded in surviving the most dangerous vicissitudes of the, quote, Cultural Revolution. Far from resigning himself to the retirement which had been imposed on him, Mao immediately began to carve out the long and devious path which would take him victoriously back to power. The direct confrontation at Lushan, in which Peng and Mao opposed each other, had led to a reciprocal defeat. Peng was formally denounced and stripped of his functions. Mao lost real power, and Liu Shaoqi, the third party and referee of the conflict, reaped the advantage. However, Peng was not completely beaten. In the years which followed, he saw the party make a de facto ratification of his criticism, while an increasingly eloquent movement of opinion sought his official rehabilitation. But nor had Mao lost everything. To begin with, he had maintained a bridgehead at the summit, Lin Biao. By obtaining the nomination of Lin Biao to the position of Minister of Defense in place of Peng Dehuai, Mao had secured a trump card, a pledge for his future return to power. Of course, Mao's adversaries underestimated at the time the effects which his promotion of Lin Biao was going to have in the long term. Like mediocre chess players confronted by a superior tactician, they were all obsessed by the opportunity of making a big gain immediately, the neutralization of Mao. They paid too little attention to the movement of an apparent insignificant pawn, but it was the move which in the final analysis was to turn the game and ultimately to precipitate their own downfall. Lin Biao was a sickly and secretive character with a mediocre education. Devoid of presence or eloquence, Lin Biao was extremely nervous and had a dull and timid look about him. But Lin Biao had an intense capacity for hard work, concentration, and calculation. Lin Biao was a professional soldier who, within the limits of his trade, had acquired the reputation of being an exceptionally competent strategist. Lin Biao had a network of men faithful to Lin Biao, but these were quite strictly limited to his former subordinates in the Fourth Army. Besides this, it was difficult for Lin Biao to rival the prestige of more assertive personalities such as Peng Dehuai or Ho Lung. Lin Biao had scarcely succeeded in making an impression even on the most favorably disposed witnesses. In 1961, Edgar Snow described himself as, quote, a more compliant and less colorful figure, end quote, than Peng Dehuai. Lin Biao's influence in the party was practically nil, but beneath Lin Biao's sickly and unobtrusive exterior, Lin Biao was devoured by ambition. Only the Cultural Revolution was to reveal the full extent of this. Lin Biao nursed a long-standing rivalry with Peng Dehuai, the favorite elder son who had blocked his promotion for a long time. In 1954, the post of Minister of Defense in Zhou Enlai's cabinet, for which Lin already entertained ambitions, was allotted to Peng. Later in the same year, Lin suffered an enigmatic eclipse from public life, which lasted a year and coincided with the purge of Cao Kang. In the 1951-53 period, Cao Kang, probably as at the instigation of Beria, had set up the basis of a, quote, independent fief, end quote, in Manchuria. He was purged in February 1954. Lin Biao, who had been closely associated with Cao Kang during the Manchurian campaign of 1947, had also made long stays in the USSR between 1939 and 1942, and again between 1951 and 1953. He enjoyed the favors of Stalin. Immediately after the purge of Cao Kang, Lin disappeared from the political scene for a year. Immediately after the purge of Cao Kang, Lin disappeared from the political scene for a year. That's in italics. From March 1954 to March 1955. Such are the pieces of this ambiguous jigsaw puzzle. In April 1955, Lin rejoined the Politburo, where he figured in 12th position in the hierarchy immediately after Peng. From this moment on, his rise accelerated. In 1956, after the 8th Party Congress, Lin rose to 7th position in the new Politburo, while Peng fell back to 14th position. The 8th Central Committee had 4 vice presidents: Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, Chu Tai, and Chen Yun. In spring 1958, Lin, who in the previous year had distinguished himself in the rectification campaign against the right, was made 5th vice president. In 1959, the Peng Dehuai affair definitely fused Mao's interests with those of Lin. Seeing the chance to eliminate his old rival, Lin distinguished himself as the main inspiration behind the purge of Peng. The latter's disgrace was pronounced at an enlarged conference of the Central Committee's Military Commission, and the chairman of this conference, held in April 1959, was Lin Biao. As a reward for Lin Biao's efforts, Lin Biao was given his victim's hide. On the 17th of September, Lin Biao replaced Peng as Minister of Defense. Once Lin Biao was installed in this new position, Lin Biao got down to forging the new instrument which, some years later, would enable Mao to carry out a successful coup d'etat against the party, namely an ideologically reorganized army during the decisive moments of the Cultural Revolution would be able to replace the party apparatus over which Mao had lost all control. Mao had scarcely been at his post for 12 days. It might not be Mao. I think he's talking about Lin Biao now. Lin Biao had scarcely been in his post for 12 days when Lin Biao published an article titled, "Let us march forward with giant steps, waving high the red standard of the general line of the party and the military thought of Mao Zedong." Lin Biao had now committed himself. Once and for all, Lin Biao had staked his political future on the Mao Zedong card, and he glued himself unconditionally to Mao as servant, defender, devotee, and prophet. The experiments which Mao had been prevented from pursuing in the party and from executing over the country as a whole were now, through the agency of Lin Biao, going to be tested out at the narrower level of the army. Within the army, as if in an airtight chamber, the, quote, philosophy of the, quote, Great Leap and the communes was applied. Having been battered, denounced, and abandoned in the outside world, revolutionary virtue was substituted for professional expertise. The spiritual factor took priority over the material and technical factors, and there was a return to the archaic principles of the peasant guerrilla. Between 1960 and 1962, Lin Biao was busy developing the people's militias and implanting the ideological basis for, quote, People's War. Lin Biao launched various movements. First, in May 1960, came the 3-8 movement, San Pa So Fang, which was inspired by one of Mao's instructions consisting of 3 principles: a resolute and correct political orientation, a keen and austere style of work, and supple mobile tactics, and the 4 terms in 8 characters: unity, intensity, seriousness, liveliness. Then, in October 1960, came the Four Principles, formulated by Lin Biao. The Four Principles were priority to the human factor over the weapons factor, priority to the political work over other kinds, in political work, priority to the ideological task over others, and in the ideological task, priority to living thought over books. Then he organized the elite companies, Su Hao and Lien Tu. The deeper meaning of these various initiatives was not revealed until the advent of the, quote, Cultural Revolution, when the party was disintegrating and the mass organizations were forced to copy these carefully prepared military models. The, quote, elite companies, end quote, served as a prototype for the famous, quote, support the left detachments, end quote. The elite detachments, which were parachuted to all four corners of the country during the Cultural Revolution to crush local revolutionary initiatives, break strikes, impose order in the schools and factories, marshal rebellious youth into disciplinary battalions, protect the local mandarinate, exercise police power, and guarantee the running of industries and railways. This fell under the heading of the, quote, three supports and two militaries, end quote, San Shi Liang Chun. That is to say, support for the left, support for the workers, support for the peasants, military administration, and military education. In January 1962, as we have already seen, Lin Biao finally defended in public the Maoist line which had been criticized by Liu Shaoqi during the, quote, Conference of the 7,000, end quote. Throughout this first act of his new political career, the two basic characteristics which he was displayed later during his ascendancy in the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, appeared. One was a jealous ambition which could not tolerate the presence of any rival. This was to play a big part in the weeding out process during the purges of the Cultural Revolution, and was largely responsible for the extreme mediocrity of the new ruling team. Lin Biao could only tolerate Confederates or insignificant figures around Lin Biao, and anyone who had some depth presented a threat to Lin Biao. The other characteristic was Lin Biao's shameless and unstinting flattery of Mao. Lin's sole political capital, Lin Biao was otherwise incapable of conceiving of formulating any idea of his own, was deposed as the supreme confessor of the Maoist revelation. There is no truth but Mao's truth, and Lin Biao's sole prophet. At a certain point during the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, Lin Biao was to make a bold and somewhat premature attempt to convey his God to heaven, and keep him there while the prophet himself took personal care of affairs down below. But Mao Zedong called a rapid halt to this attempt to kick him upstairs. On the 10th of November 1965, the Shanghai newspaper Wen Hui Pao published Yao Wenyuan's article, quote, A Criticism of the Recent Historical Libretto, The Dismissal of Hai Zhui, end quote. This article sparked off what was eventually to be known as the, quote, Cultural Revolution. It unleashed the formidable chain reaction that Mao used to carry out his coup d'etat against the party and regain power, but it did not spring out of nowhere. It was not some fortuitous accident. It was preceded by a slow and laborious undermining process, and there had been several previous attempts to light the touch paper. These had not been successful because on each occasion they were scented and diffused by those in power. Let us first of all examine the history of these failed attempts of the 1960 to 65 period. Between 1960 and 1962, Mao's political career touched its nadir. It is possible that the setback which he suffered at Lushan was aggravated by a physical collapse, the one having provoked the other. Uncontrollable rumors reported that at Lushan, Mao suddenly, seeing himself put in the position of an accused man, reacted so violently that he suffered a fit. The text of the speech which he improvised on the 23rd of July 1959 is certainly remarkably incoherent. But after September 1962, the 10th plenary session of the 8th Central Committee, Mao seemed to emerge from his despondency and to renew his energies. In his honorary capacity as chairman of the party, Mao had no power, but Mao had a platform. While Mao was reduced to impotence, Mao was certainly not reduced to silence. Certainly Mao could... I don't know why I said that. certainly not reduced to silence. Could Mao use the prestige of his word alone to turn the situation back in his favor? The history of the period between 1962 and 1965 illustrates the narrow limits of Mao's influence. The men in power let Mao launch highly incendiary appeals into a vacuum because they were calmly certain that in the end the means of execution were theirs alone. On each occasion, the application of Mao's various political initiatives was put under supervision and handed over to his adversaries, who neutralized their explosive potential without any trouble. In September 1962, Mao went back into the arena to take the platform at the 10th plenary session of the 8th Central Committee. He touched on three themes in his speech. Their deeper intentions were to be understood better than with the hindsight of the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, but at the same time their seeds of subversion were quickly eradicated by the apparatus. Mao dealt first with the problem of youth whose revolutionary training had to be ensured if China was not to one day change its colors. Secondly, Mao dealt with the problem of the countryside where the immobility of the cadres and peasants' property instincts were threatening the development of socialism. Thirdly, there was the problem of culture, which was monopolized by intellectuals who were defaulting on the socialist ideal and anesthetizing opinion in order to prepare for a capitalist restoration. These three fuses were all to lead to the power barrel of the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, but Mao had scarcely lit them when the apparatus moved to extinguish them. However, Mao took advantage of the fact that the cultural theme had a relatively minor importance and succeeded in foxing the vigilance of those in power so as to relight this last torch suddenly and set off the explosion. The explosion was christened, quote, cultural, end quote, simply because of its initial pretext. It could just as easily have been called the, quote, youth revolution or the, quote, countryside revolution, end quote, if one or the other of these first attempts had made it. Of these three different attempts, it was the first which was most quickly rendered harmless. Mao was given no chance to stir up the youth. The Maoist initiative was manipulated by a skilled bureaucracy and converted into a dose of chloroform, which was administered throughout 1963 with the famous campaigns to emulate model heroes such as Lai Feng and others. As for the educational system, the changes made were purely formal, and teachers continued to encourage the, quote, expert, end quote, as against the, quote, red, end quote. The second theme, although it too was finally aborted, met greater vicissitudes. There is no doubt that Mao had placed his greatest hopes here. Between 1963 and 1965, Mao gave birth to the famous, quote, movement for socialist education in the countryside, end quote, which was nothing less than a failed attempt at the, quote, Cultural Revolution. Subsequently, the, quote, Cultural Revolution officially recognized this movement's role as a precursor. The story of the, quote, movement for socialist education in the countryside, end quote, is an exemplary illustration of the contradiction between Mao and the apparatus. In this conflict between inspiration and execution, it was always the latter which had the last word. By diverting, sabotaging, and neutralizing all the attempts launched by the former, when the movement did not succeed in getting off the ground, Mao tried to invigorate it by means of the campaign of the, quote, four cleanups, end quote. In theory, this meant organizing associations of poor and lower middle peasants and using them to purge local cadres. This Maoist idea of rousing the base against the apparatus was against the interests of the party, which sought to keep the base under the strict control of the apparatus, but the, quote, 10 articles, end quote, which defined this Maoist conception of the movement were followed by a second series of, quote, 10 articles, end quote, dictated by those in power, which practically annulled the effects of the first series by giving priority to the economic imperatives of production and by consolidating the authority of the apparatus. In 1964, the, quote, associations of poor and lower middle peasants, end quote, were put back entirely under the control of the party committees attached to local government. The peasants were now, quote, roused, end quote, only under the strict supervision of the authorities. Faced with this sabotage of his undertaking, Mao counteracted in January 1965 when he decreed the, quote, 23 articles, end quote. This extraordinary document already contained the whole of the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote, in embryo. In fact, it declared, quote, there is a sharp class struggle with the enemies of socialism seeking to take advantage of a, quote, peaceful evolution, end quote, to restore capitalism. This class struggle is reflected in the party where various levers of command have been corrupted or usurped. This struggle is reflected in the party where various levers of command have been corrupted or usurped, end quote. Article 1. Quote, it is a question of rectifying and purging those who, bearing the authority of the bearing the authority of the party, have taken the capitalist road. Some of them are very highly placed, and beneath their mask have changed their real nature. End quote. Article 2. The masses had to be boldly roused, given their head without control being exercised from above. Article 5. On the subject of the cadres. Quote, where power is held by cadres who have committed serious faults, it will be necessary to seize power by sheer force. Where necessary, if the local militias are not sound, it will be necessary to disarm the local militias and give the local militias arms to poor and lower middle peasants. End quote. Article 9. Here they are, all the elements of the Cultural Revolution, already brought together in this initial program. We find, in effect, the central idea that the party itself is corrupted to the very top. The party, in the person of some of the party's highest authorities, is to be the new movement's target. We also find the principle of, quote, seizure of power, by force if necessary. This is to be carried out against the party authorities by the masses, who are themselves outside the party. This principle is clearly stated. All the objectives and methods of the, quote, Cultural Revolution were thus already defined. One may note in passing that there was nothing to do with, quote, culture in all this. Mao's original idea had been to launch his coup d'etat on the terrain which Mao was most familiar with, the countryside. If the real, quote, Cultural Revolution eventually used the cultural pretext as its point of departure and became essentially an urban movement, that is simply because the real Cultural Revolution was a substitute solution for the aborted peasant movement initially envisaged by Mao. At first sight, it seems surprising that Liu Shaoqi and his associates were unable at the time to decipher the writing on the wall which these, quote, 23 articles, end quote, constituted, but in actual fact they had little reason to feel uneasy. They were far from being a small and fragile clique of usurpers. They were a majority force and wielded complete control over the organs of party and government. In contrast to their power, Mao no longer embodied anything but an impotent and isolated opposition. How could they have taken seriously the threats which these Maoist initiatives contained? In the last analysis, the execution of the initiatives depended on their own authority, and recent experience had shown that the confidence which they had in their own power was not exaggerated. For all their dynamite, the, quote, 23 articles, end quote, fizzled out. The peasant masses were kept closely in check by the party and did not show the slightest inclination to, quote, rise up, end quote. One had to wait for the revelations made by the Cultural Revolution itself to find out, with hindsight, the kind of explosion that had been avoided at the time. In the end, therefore, it was the blast of the three themes mentioned above, the cultural problem, which gave Mao the opportunity to set his coup d'etat in motion. But even on this cultural terrain, Mao still encountered a number of obstacles and often got bogged down. During his September 1962 speech, Mao had opened fire on the writers and artists who were using the pretext of their creative activity to conduct, quote, anti-party maneuvers and to create a climate of opinion that would facilitate the, quote, restoration of capitalism, end quote. The initial declaration of war was followed in 1963 by campaigns against various intellectuals, artists, and writers. These campaigns on the whole lacked bite and did not take off properly. In 1964 and 1965, criticisms directed against the Marxist philosopher and theoretician Yang Xin-chen and the, quote, synthesis of contraries, end quote, as well as against the novelist and critic Xiao Chuan-lin and his literary theory of, quote, ambiguous personalities, end quote, turned into a quite Byzantine affair. The authorities succeeded in confining the discussion to a purely academic framework and did not allow it to generate the political developments which Mao hoped for. Mao, however, was desperately trying to guard the movement on. In June 1964, during his speech to a Congress of the All-China Federation of Writers and Artists, he denounced the intellectuals once again as the most dangerous instigators of revisionism in China. Simultaneously, Madame Mao, Chiang Ching, emerged for the first time from the shadows to which she had so long been relegated. Chiang Ching, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce her name properly. It's Chiang Ching is how it looks like here. She tried to bolster her husband's cultural offensive in the specific domain of the theater. Jiang Cheng's form of the opera would later be hailed in retrospect as one of the starting points of the Cultural Revolution, but meanwhile the attempt to create revolutionary opera was sabotaged by the authorities concerned from the ministerial level down to the actors. The fiasco of the reform of the opera was a snub to Mao and once again illustrated the state of impotence to which he had been reduced. Madame Mao's speech of July 1964 on the reform of the opera, Tang Ching Chu, Keming, did not even achieve the distinction of being published and had to wait until 1967 to be finally exhumed to the sound of trumpets by the Cultural Revolution. Madame Mao did not forget the insults which he had undergone at the hands of various personalities from the world of culture, cinema, and theater during the Cultural Revolution. Not one escaped her vengeance. But although Mao saw his various initiatives translated one after another into purely formal movements deprived of their potentially subversive content, where the army was concerned, he was preparing behind the scenes through the agency of Lin Biao that was to become the real instrument of his coup d'etat. I have already described the role played by Lin Biao between 1960 and 1962 in the way in which the army was gradually prepared for its future political intervention as a substitute for the party. These preparations were pursued intensively between 1963 and 1965. The campaign to emulate Lei Fang, 1963, insipid as it was, at least imposed the new idea that the military could provide a political model whose significance went beyond the particular framework of the army and was to become universally applicable. Still more explicit was the fact that from the beginning of 1964 there was a new campaign inviting the whole population to study and imitate the political example of the army. This type of psychological preparation would enable the army to be presented on the outbreak of the Cultural Revolution as the source of a correct doctrine and the legitimate bearer of political authority in place of the overthrown party. In the same year, in the governmental and administrative sectors, a network of departments of political work was gradually installed. It closely followed the system of political commissars in the army and functioned independently of the normal hierarchy in the party offices. These networks, whose function was purely political, were to play the role of a Maoist apparatus parallel to the regular apparatus. This political network was launched with a massive injection of military cadres. From the beginning of 1965, more than 200,000 of them found themselves parachuted into civilian life. In the same year, army officers began to occupy posts in propaganda, a key sector which was jealously guarded by the party. In industry and finance, where it would be essential to maintain a modicum of normal activity once the coup d'etat had plunged the country into chaos, precautions were taken from 1965 onwards to ensure that the army could take over at some future point. Officers were installed in the responsible posts normally reserved for civilians, while a number of civilian cadres were sent to the military institutes to be subjected to educational sessions. At this point, the two parallel movements conducted by Mao, his public interventions in the cultural sphere, which seemed to be headed for failure, and his covert placement of parallel networks, which was the prelude to the military coup d'etat, were about to meet and join together in a pincer movement. Events speeded up and took a decisive turn in autumn 1965. In September, during a meeting of the Central Committee, Mao made another speech denouncing the bourgeois mode of thought. Although the Cultural Revolution was subsequently to date its initial impulse from this speech, at the time it seemed destined to take to the same fate as all the other appeals which the prophet had made from the middle of his desert. The terms of the speech seemed moreover to lack fire, and no doubt strong opposition would once more be raised on the Central Committee against this intemperate overbidding of the, quote, class struggle. In the following months, there was an editorial in the Red Flag, quote, "Let us adopt the proletarian view of the world in order to build our new world," end quote, which, under the pretext of developing the Maoist theme of criticizing the old world, actually managed to deprive it of its offensive quality by insisting on the fact that the fight against the traditional view of the world would be long and would therefore have to be conducted in a subtle and patient manner, avoiding excesses. Was Mao once again about to see his chances of launching the long-prepared offensive vanish? That was how it looked, but on 10th of November 1965, the first bomb exploded and set off the chain reaction of the, quote, Cultural Revolution, end quote. The Shanghai newspaper Wen Hu Pao published an article by a still unknown scribe named Yao Wenyuan. The article was entitled "A Criticism of the Recent Historical Libretto, the Dismissal of Hai Jui." Ping Xin Pian Li Shi Chu Hai Zhui Pa Quan. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, folks. To the uninitiated reader, the article in question scarcely seemed to be more than one of those laborious dissertations crammed with cliches and slogans which the official press produces by the million. Furthermore, the subject was singularly lacking in topicality. The piece by Wu Han, which the article took to task, was 4 years old. The major part of the article developed a historical discussion which was deliberately off the point. It was like a critique of La Fontaine's fables based on zoology, or a refutation of Gulliver's Travels in the name of geography. The real political implications of the Hai Zhui piece were only dealt with in an indirect and obscure manner, but the conclusion they led to was quite explicit. Quote, "We consider the libretto, the dismissal of Hai Zhui, to be far from a fragrant flower. It is in fact a poisonous weed." End quote. But the article would have struck the initiated reader like a bolt of lightning. Wu Han was the deputy mayor of Peking. Wu Han had published the libretto with the general backing of the party organs and the personal backing of Peng Chen. And here, Wu Han was attacked by surprise in public without any previous discussion within the apparatus, without the normal channels of the official propaganda organs being consulted, and on the sole initiative of an official provincial daily. What could lie behind this inconceivable piece of audacity bordering on sedition? The first reaction of official circles in Peking was to make direct contact with the Shanghai Party Committee and ask in threatening tones, quote, "What's behind your decision to publish the article by Yao? Why didn't you warn us? Where's your party spirit?" End quote. Peking was soon to discover what lay behind Shanghai's seditious defiance. Mao Zedong had been reduced to impotence in the capital, but Mao Zedong had gradually succeeded in converting Shanghai into a loyal political fortress. More serious still, less than 3 weeks later, on the 29th of November, the official army organ, Jie Fang Chun Pao, gave its own backing to the attacks on Wu Han. And Lin Biao, who had just published his pamphlet, Long Live the Victory of the People's War, which defended and illustrated Maoist principles and refuted the technical ideas of war espoused by Ho Lung and Lu Zhuiqing, continued to urge Maoization on the army. In December, he promulgated his 5 instructions on the, quote, preeminence of politics, end quote. Peking was beginning to realize that this time the opposition organized by Mao had some real force at its command, and decided to mark time for a while. But those in power were not unduly disquieted. They remained confident that, as in the past, the surest way of disarming Mao would be to avoid open confrontation. It would be sufficient to give Mao formal satisfaction by organizing a purge of cultural circles. This purge would be carefully directed and controlled by the leading party organs, and they could easily arrange for the whole business to remain an inoffensive comedy. The word, quote, comedy is no exaggeration. In January 1966, the Central Committee set up a small group of 5 members to supervise this cultural purge, which was already being called the Cultural Revolution in the party's internal memos, and the individual placed at the head of this executive commission was none other than Peng Chen. In other words, the task of drawing up the prosecution dossier was handed over to the chief defendant. It was Peng Chen whom the Maoists were aiming at, through Wu Han and subsequently Teng To. And it was at precisely this crossroads that Mao, that incomparable tactician, was waiting for his enemies. The latter were certain they had full control of the situation and were blinded by an excessive confidence in their own power. They were to fall headlong into the trap which had been patiently set for them. Prudence should have suggested to Peng that he disown his protégés and hand them over to be purged in order to save his own position. With the entire party apparatus behind him, he did the opposite. He counterattacked. On the 7th of February 1966, he presented a draft report on the work of the Group of 5 to the Central Committee. This draft had an insolent formality about it. It began by recalling the proposals once made by Mao himself in 1957 during the 100 Flowers campaign concerning the need for a great blossoming and for the expression of all different kinds of opinion, even non-Marxist opinion. Quote, expression of all different kinds of opinion, even non-Marxist opinions, end quote. It proposed that the rectification movement should only be carried out slowly and carefully. Quote, problems of a cultural order are complex and cannot be dealt with in the twinkling of an eye, end quote. The guiding principle should be, quote, the search for truth on the basis of facts and equality of all before the truth, end quote. In passing, he launched a ferocious swipe in Mao's direction. Quote, we must not behave like those intellectual tyrants who always act in an arbitrary manner and resort to force in order to gain the advantage of adherence of others. We must encourage the maintenance of truth and always be ready to correct our faults, end quote. The central idea in the draft was that the problem of Wuhan's writings belonged to the sphere of historical studies. The discussion should therefore be led away from the political domain and brought back to the academic domain where it could be analyzed at leisure. This may have been disingenuous, but Peng Chen was giving Yao Yuan a taste of his own medicine. If at the end of this discussion opinions continue to differ, one would have to reserve judgment and postpone the conclusion till later. Everything seemed to indicate that the men in power would once again switch the points and shunt the Maoists into the engine shed. Were they not in a majority on the Central Committee? And in fact, the draft was approved by the Central Committee several days later, the 12th of February. But Peng inadvisably abused his advantage. Peng authorized the Peking press to defend Wuhan and to counterattack against Yao Yuan. The moment he did this, he exposed himself. When the wind turned, no one wanted or dared to come to his rescue. 3 months later, the same Central Committee that had ratified the draft, the quote, February outline, rescinded it and accompanied this decision with a circular, the famous 16th of May memorandum, which opened the floodgates of the Great Purge. Peng was to be the first victim. What had happened between the ratification of the draft on the 12th of February and its denunciation the 16th of May? The real cultural revolution had taken off openly and irreversibly. It is the army which holds the key to the story of how Mao managed in the space of these 3 months to overturn the balance of forces and make his breakthrough. The details of this military coup d'etat are still unclear, but the broad lines are known. For several years, Lin had been preparing the army for direct intervention in the political scene, as we have seen above. Lin Biao still had one obstacle to overcome, and it was a considerable one. Lin Biao's grip over the army was not total. It was countered at the top by someone who held considerable power. This was Luo Zhiqing, the chief of the general staff, who was supported in turn by Ho Lung. The latter, since 1961, maintained a controlling grip on all the activities of the Central Committee's military commission. The obstacle was finally eliminated at the beginning of 1966. Luo was arrested on an obscure pretext, conspiracy against the state, in February or March. He was submitted to sessions of self-criticism and on the 18th of March tried to commit suicide by jumping out of a window, but only succeeded in breaking his legs. Luo was thus the very first victim of the Cultural Revolution. Luo was purged on the quiet, and the affair was not made public until much later. It was revealed at mass meetings in Peking in December 1966, the 21st and 24th. We can see from this how much spontaneous initiative came from the Maoist masses. The bird presented to them was already slaughtered and trussed. This secret operation left the way open for Lin Biao. With the assistance of Yang Chengwu, first deputy leader of the general staff, who got troop movements held in the northern military region of China, and of Fu Chengpi, second in command of the military region of Peking. Lin Biao was assured of the military control of Peking. Yang Chengwu and Fu Chengpi were rewarded for their decisive action, which put Mao back in the saddle. The former was put at the head of the general staff, and the second was promoted to commander of the Peking military region. But their moment of glory was not to last. In 1968, they were both ruthlessly eliminated. The means was an obscure accusation that they were plotting a coup d'etat. The Cultural Revolution was an incredible grand valse, glittering with promotions and purges. Not only does one search in vain for an expression of the, quote, spontaneous will of the masses, end quote, they have always been presented with fait accomplis and play the role of a choir or a hired audience. The masses have no decision-making power over events and are not even considered worth the trouble of informing properly once the event is over. One cannot even decipher any ideological coherence. The skittles were used to knock each other over. Once Lin Biao had deployed his troops behind the scenes, the Cultural Revolution could begin. The job of announcing officially that it had been launched went fittingly to the army. It was, in fact, the Chai Fang Chun Pao People's Liberation Army Daily which published the 2 articles marking the beginning of the movement. Quote, "Let us wave on high the great red standard of the thought of Mao Zedong. Let us participate actively in the great socialist cultural revolution." End quote. Editorial 18th of April. And, quote, "Let us never forget the class struggle." End quote. In this editorial, May 4th. In this context, the Central Committee's repudiation of the Peng Chen draft, which it had approved 3 months earlier, is easily explained. After he had rallied Lin Biao's troops, Mao obtained the services of the police and the secret apparatus of the security police. Peng Chen found himself alone, and no one now dared to compromise himself by coming to his aid. He fell in June, and this skittle also knocked over Liu Tingyi, the head of propaganda. The great slaughter had begun. Nothing could plug the breaches which Mao had opened, and it grew with dizzying speed until it engulfed everything. What were the men in power to do now that they were faced with this situation? Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, and their whole apparatus. They realized that they could no longer stop the vast upheaval which had now set in, but they continued to believe that they were in a position to control the way it was going and to limit its range. With the aim of controlling events from the summit, they delegated, quote, working groups, end quote, to go into action on the ground. The job of these groups was, of course, to suppress the, quote, revolution, end quote. In this way, they would avoid condemning themselves out of their own mouths as Peng Chen had done with the appearance of his draft. They were under the illusion that once a clearing had been cut with the sacrifice of Peng Chen, Liu Tingyi, and Chao Yang, the flames would not spread. The illusion was quite understandable. An extension of the purge to the summit of the apparatus was unthinkable, since it would have involved the destruction of the party and the scuttling of the regime. But this was precisely the flaw in their logic. Mao did the unthinkable and cornered his rivals precisely by destroying the party and scuttling the regime. The man who, during the Great Leap Forward, had already demonstrated that he was prepared to sacrifice the interests of China for the interests of the regime, was to demonstrate during the, quote, Cultural Revolution that he was prepared to sacrifice the interests of the regime for those of his own personal power. The military coup d'etat gave the Maoists control of Peking, but the apparatus still controlled its vast network in the provinces. This too was dealt with by one of Mao's master strokes. Mao succeeded in luring Tao Chu out of his powerful South China citadel by offering him the post of head of propaganda in Peking and a dizzying rise to 4th position in the new hierarchy. Tao made it to Peking in July 1966. He was thus cut off from his base. This was part of Mao's game, and Tao fell a few months later. Liu and Teng thought that by unloading Peng Chen and Liu Tingyi, they had saved their position. Tao Chu deluded himself into thinking that he simply needed to betray Liu and Teng in order to obtain a magnificent promotion. Yang Cheng Wu and Fu Chung Pi thought they deserved their new power because they had made the initial contribution by force of arms. Wang Li, Qi Pen Yu, and the Red Guards trusted the word of Mao Zedong, trusting the word of Mao Zedong, put themselves in the front line of his, quote, revolution. All of them, one after the other, colleagues and rivals, betrayers and betrayed, victims and executioners, friends and enemies, eventually found themselves cast into limbo. They had not realized that in this lottery in which all the dice were rigged, there was only one winner, and he had been appointed in advance, Lin Biao. Where is the, quote, culture, and where is the, quote, revolution? In fact, the whole affair was simply a settling of accounts in the corners of palace corridors, and drunk with its first victory, the Maoist faction allowed the mask to slip for an instant and confessed that the whole mechanism of the, quote, Cultural Revolution had only been an ingenious ploy to get rid of the individuals who held power. After Peng Chen and his acolytes had fallen, the Red Flag, 9th of June 1966, wrote, quote, "The full exposure of their revisionist nature required a certain interval of time and the development of a certain favorable climate. Even a poisonous snake does not come out of that poisonous snake's hole unless there are certain favorable climatic conditions. The moment these poisonous snakes come out of their hole, they were captured by Chairman Mao." End quote. Red flag, July 1966. Now that Mao had the forces of the Peking garrison available to control the seat of power, Mao felt in a position to convene a plenary session of the 8th Central Committee, the 11th session 1 to 12, August 1966, and the first to be convened since 1962. Even in Peking, the coup d'etat had already sealed the fate of the members of the apparatus. In this sense, the Cultural Revolution was over before it had even started. The gigantic task which Mao was to be faced with over the next 3 years was to seize power in the provinces and to have reabsorbed the innumerable and powerful local pockets of resistance. The discipline and cohesive strength of the party were too great to allow the base of this monolithic organism to rise against the top. And while the party as a whole did not remain actively faithful to Liu Shaoqi, at least it remained hostile and deliberately passive towards the injunction to, quote, rise. The rigidity of its network, which covered the whole country, prevented it from responding to Peking's appeal. It therefore became urgently necessary to improvise a new force simultaneously and all over the country, which would reproduce the Peking coup on a local scale. The army had enabled Mao to take power in Peking, but it could not be entrusted with the same task in the provinces. The troops on whom Lin Biao could count unconditionally were not numerous enough to enable a simultaneous action to be carried out all over the country. There were still powerful groups within the army whose allegiance was to chiefs such as Ho Lung and Liu Juiqing. These groups were largely impervious to Lin Biao's influence. In several military regions, they held territorial bases, which could have been turned into a fortified camp, deaf to the orders of Peking. At that moment, it would have been dangerous to entrust the seizure of power in the provinces to the local garrisons. In several military regions, this would have involved an inordinate growth in power for certain commanders of whom Mao and Lin were not exactly sure, and would have given the apparatus an advantage by creating autonomous fortresses. For a time, the army had to be restricted to the position of a neutral observer. The battering ram which Mao used to dismantle the party apparatus was therefore made up of the, quote, revolutionary masses, end quote, with the youth in the front line. The way in which Mao mobilized and used the Red Guards is very similar to the way in which the Dowager Empress Zhu Xi manipulated the Boxers. He turned against his enemies the mass of popular discontent which had been brought about by his own regime. I want to repeat that. He turned against his enemies the mass of popular discontent which had been brought about by his own regime, and which with greater understanding should have been turned against himself. Just like the Boxers, the Red Guards were inspired by a genuine, powerful revolutionary dynamism and patriotism, but they were likewise lacking political experience and informed, educated cadres. Their naive and primitive mysticism was at the disposal of an old and experienced politician who, once he had reached his objective, did not scruple to rid himself of those innocent helpers. The bureaucratic despotism which Mao himself had established had for a long time been the cause of dissatisfaction and frustration among the youth, and they were on the point of exploding. All Mao needed to do was denounce his personal rivals as the sole origin of a system which he himself was in fact the author, and then open the floodgates of popular anger against them, and he had got rid of them. But when this wave had accompanied its task and turned back on itself, it would see that it had not in fact accomplished anything at all. It had dropped the puppets, but the puppet master remained the same and was sitting high and dry on the bank already closing the lock gates. The Red Guards realized in the end that they had been tricked, but it was too late. At that moment, when their role was finished, Mao was able to abandon them to military repression and replace them with a collection of mandarins who were identical to the original ones. To my understanding, a lot of the violence, a lot of the actual killing in the Cultural Revolution, obviously the Red Guards did violence, but I believe that a lot of the actual death toll comes from the action of the People's Liberation Army against the Red Guards to crush or to quell the chaotic excesses, the extreme chaotic excesses, or just the political violence that was tearing the country apart, was put to an end by the deployment of the PLA to put down the Cultural Revolution. And I think a lot of the people that died in it died in that period of the crackdown. The Red Guards realized in the end that they had been tricked, but it was too late at that moment. When their role was finished, Mao was able to abandon them to military repression and replace them with a collection of mandarins who were identical to the original ones. So yeah, that military repression was no joke. But in 1966, the illusions of the young people were still intact. They enthusiastically grasped the unheard-of freedom offered by the famous 16-point charter of the Cultural Revolution, promulgated on the 8th of August by the 11th plenary sessions of the 8th Central Committee. According to the terms of this document, the masses were handed the right to denounce and overthrow the party authorities that were oppressing them. From mid-August to mid-September, China exploded and fell prey to its young people. Throughout the provinces, the Red Guards put the local authorities on trial, but the authorities defended themselves by organizing their own Red Guards. The confusion was total. The chaos at one point benefited the local authorities, which sought to emancipate themselves from Peking. Faced with this situation, Peking attempted to regroup its forces and to regain control over the Red Guards. A unified command was imposed on the latter in front. In order to coordinate their activities, they were given military, quote, instructors, end quote, which made the movement dependent on the army. In mid-September, Zhou Enlai issued a warning to the Red Guards. Their job was to get rid of certain designated individuals, not to call the system into question. I want to repeat that. I believe that's also part of the big reason why the Red Guards, the PLA was called in to crush the Red Guards, is that Red Guards were stepping beyond the prescribed boundaries of what the Cultural Revolution was supposed to be about. So, for instance, in Shanghai, I know there's like in the Cultural Revolution, like there was genuine left-wing forces in the Cultural Revolution that tried to like in the Shanghai Commune, that tried to do something, replicate something of the sort of like the Paris Commune, against the bureaucracy. Still in kind of like confused, like Maoist language, but to my understanding at least, that is like the main impetus, is that they thought they could have like this, was that like Mao and his circle thought they could have this kind of like controlled purge that like kind of like stripped the state of disloyal bureaucrats and replaced them with loyal bureaucrats who were willing to follow Mao's delusional whims. But when the economic system of the PRC was in question, things began to get dicey for the initiators of the Cultural Revolution. Anyway, where am I? The chaos at one point benefited the local authorities, which sought to emancipate themselves from Peking. Faced with this situation, Peking attempted to regroup Peking's forces and to regain control over the Red Guards. A unified command was imposed on the latter in order to coordinate their activities. They were given military, quote, instructors, which made the movement dependent on the army. In mid-September, Zhou Enlai issued a warning to the Red Guards. Their job was to get rid of certain designated individuals, not to call the system in question. Peking strove from this point on to direct the Red Guards by remote control, but its success rate was uneven. So maybe I'm talking about something different than what's going on here, because it seems like they're talking about like Peking, which is trying to keep things under control. I don't know. Forget what I'm saying. Or don't forget what I'm saying, but if it's confused, ignore it. From 1965 onwards, new elements began to appear. Peking exercised uncertain control over the provinces and found itself boxed in between contradictory imperatives. Either it would press on with the movement for local seizures of power at the risk of plunging the country into anarchy and civil war, or it would reestablish order by reinstating those local authorities which the coup d'etat had tried to eliminate. Rather, it could keep the army to the margins of the conflict at the risk of getting bogged down in the chaos, or it could let the army intervene and see an uncontrollable growth in the power of regional commanders who were hostile to the Maoists. In the diary of the period between 1967 and 1969, which occupies the next section of this book, we shall follow these developments at the level of the day-to-day conflict. The end. Thank you for listening.